Hello and welcome back to Project 380. On today's episode I'm going to be putting the transmission into what may be its final resting place. So as I said in a previous video, I'm going to be sticking with the standard 6-speed for now, and I'll see how long it lasts. This has been cleaned and painted and almost ready to go in, but a couple of routine things need to be done first. So since the gearbox is still out of the car and I've got access to this, I'm going to change the rear seal, as I don't know how old it is and I cannot remember whether it's leaking. So I'm going to change that for a genuine Mazda. This part of the seal is actually a metal ring, so I need to separate that from the transmission. I'm going to slowly work my way around in this groove here with a hammer and chisel. Once you've got a nice gap to get a couple of screwdrivers in and it's moving a bit more free, you can pop a couple of screwdrivers in and pop the old seal out. With that out of the way, make sure you give this face and this race a good clean and make sure no debris has fallen inside the box. Now the old seal came with 2 lumps at the bottom and 1 lump at the top, so I'm going to put the new seal in exactly the same way the old one came out. But first of all I'm going to put a little bit of grease around this race here to help the seal slide in a bit better. Now you can carefully work around here with a punch and hammer, or you can use a tool that is just the right size to sit on the metal race and not touch the rubber. Make sure the metal race has sealed nicely with the transmission and wipe off the excess lubricant. Now I'm just going to cover this with a little bit of masking tape to stop any debris falling inside the box while I'm installing the box into the car. Now because I haven't got the car high enough off the ground, I'm going to have to remove my gear shifter as well. Now inside the bell housing we want to renew our release bearing or throwout bearing, whichever you want to call it, and renew the grease on the fulcrum point and give the bell housing a good clean. So to remove this, we remove it all in one, and we first remove the clutch fork by putting your fingers around the back and separating the metal pins, and then you can pull the whole lot towards you. So you can tell what I'm talking about, the back of the clutch fork is this metal spring, and you simply want to pull the metal spring apart, releasing it from the ball. As for the release bearing, it's good practice to change this every time the transmission is off. For the price of it, it's really not worth thinking about. But I have gone for the Bofi Racing full boost clutch, and it takes a different release bearing. So make sure everything is nice and clean. Make sure the shaft where the release bearing slides up and down is nice and clean. Make sure the input shaft of the gearbox is nice and clean, and the fulcrum point of the clutch fork. And a side note, the little drain hole at the bottom, you want that free flowing. If there's anything go inside the gearbox or your rear main leaks, that is where the oil or debris is going to go out of. Now to reapply a bit of grease to everything, I'm just using a bit of high temperature grease. And then to pop it all back together. First off, put the release bearing onto the clutch fork and slide it all back in. Then you simply push the clutch fork back onto its point. And then make sure everything is still free moving. Now for the difficult part. This is easiest putting the transmission in on a lift or get a friend to help you. But what I'm going to do is put the transmission on a trolley jack, slide it in, lift the trolley jack up and try and position it into place. Once in place, make sure you get a bolt in so the gearbox doesn't come back down on you. And then looking through the wheel arch, the bolt that goes underneath the starter motor is a nut and bolt on this side. The two at the top of the gearbox are easiest from inside the engine bay with a spanner. Now to attach the PPF. Remember, if you have got a Mark II, watch out for the speed sensor on the side of the box, as you really don't want to crush that wire. And then wriggle in the two long bolts that attach the PPF to the gearbox. Now on top of the PPF there is a sliding bolt stay. You may have to wiggle that to get the bolt started. I've given them a good coating of copper slip so they don't seize anymore. So I haven't quite nipped down these bolts, as we are going to come back to these in a minute and tighten them up. Now we can put in the PPF support bracket. So I've tightened the two down that go on the tail end of the gearbox, but I've only just nipped this one, as we're going to tighten this up later as well. Now for the bolts that connect the diff to the PPF. I'm going to start off by putting the top hats in the top. I've put a little bit of copper slip on them so they don't seize anymore. And the top hat that goes in the bottom of the front bolt. And just for now, I'm only going to put in the front bolt, which is the thicker one of the two. A little bit of copper slip on that first to stop that seizing into the diff. Now I'm not putting in the rear bolt just yet, that will come in a few minutes. Next is a bit of an unusual step, but now I need to put on the brace that connects the rear subframe to the chassis, but I do need to modify it first. I'm actually going to be getting rid of the middle bar and replacing it with something else. So I'm just going to grind off the welds and give it a little lick of paint. So now with the brace separated, I'm just going to bolt it up to the subframe and the chassis, just with the two front bolts each side for now. So I've left out a couple of bolts and I've got rid of the middle bar of the subframe support brace, and that's for a good reason. The middle bar I am going to be replacing with the GC Fabrication diff brace. Hopefully this will significantly reduce the movement of the diff and give me a better road feel. And now for the chassis brace that attaches onto the subframe with the rear bolts. When tightening these down by hand, make sure the top hats on top of the PPF have pulled down nicely into the PPF. Once they're nipped up, you can torque them down to 104 Newton meters to 124 Newton meters. So the next step I've seen asked many times, and I think it's an overlooked subject, and that is to align the gearbox and PPF. The purpose of aligning the gearbox and the PPF is to make sure everything runs at the right angle. If it's not running at the right angle, you can risk damage to the prop shaft, bearings or seals. So it can cause the universal joint of the prop shaft to run at the wrong angle, putting excessive pressure on it. It can put excess pressure on the tail end of the gearbox, causing the seal to wear out quicker or the bearings to wear out quicker. And in some cases you could get a rattling noise or a vibration if it's not aligned properly. And this is all done by working out the distance between the chassis rail and the bottom of the PPF. Now I have got the chassis rail reinforcements, so mine's going to be a little bit different. I'm first going to work out the difference between the chassis reinforcement and the chassis rails themselves, and then add that onto the set distance that it should be. So to begin with, I'm going to measure the difference between the original chassis rail and the chassis rail reinforcement, and it's about 7mm difference. So now, taking a straight edge and putting it on both chassis rails, we want the distance from the top of the straight edge to the bottom of the PPF to be between 60 and 71mm. Of course, if you have got the chassis reinforcement rails, you're going to have to add the difference on. And measuring mine is right between spec. If it wasn't, you'd have to move the gearbox tail end up or down to meet the requirements. So with that within spec, we're going to first do up the rear bolt which connects the bracket to the PPF. That's going to be done up between 104 Newton meters to 124 Newton meters. And the PPF to transmission bolts need to be done up to the same torque setting. Once they're all torqued up, it's worth checking the PPF alignment again. As these are now done up, the gearbox could have moved a little bit. And now for the prop shaft, I've just lightly oiled the end before putting it into that new seal. And then connect it at the diff end, making sure both maintenance surfaces are nice and clean. Now these need to be torqued up to 55 Newton meters. So now you'd usually be putting in your shifter and filling up your transmission, but I should hopefully be upgrading the shifter, so I'll do that in a future episode, and I'll be filling up all the fluids all in one go. All that's left to do is run the wiring harness up the PPF, but I'm going to be doing that off camera. So that is all for this episode. I hope you learned something from this video, and if you did, leave it down in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.